My parents loved only my sister. When I asked for help, they refused. I asked my aunt for help, but my sister framed me, and my parents threw me out of the house. Hi, Reddit. I'm Jackson, and I guess you could say I've known for a long time that my family wasn't normal. From as early as I can remember, I was just there, a kid born into a household where the spotlight shone only on my older sister, Savannah. The differences in how we were treated weren't subtle. They were huge, glaring, and impossible to ignore, even for a kid as young as I was. Savannah was the star from the day she was born. She was the firstborn, naturally talented, and, as my parents never hesitated to remind me, destined for greatness. My earliest memories of her are all wrapped in images of her accomplishments. She was always ahead in school, excelling in every subject, and she was the kind of kid teachers just adored. She got awards for perfect attendance, trophies for spelling bees, and, when she got a little older, endless scholarships and accolades. I'd like to say I was proud of her, but honestly, I barely knew her. To me, she was this untouchable figure my parents worshipped. My parents, let's call them Lisa and Tom, never hid their favoritism. They'd shower Savannah with praise and affection, making a big deal out of every little thing she did. For every good job she heard, why can't you be more like your sister? They'd frame her awards and hang them in our living room, but I can't remember a single time they did anything like that for me. One time, when I was about 7, I remember working so hard on a drawing project for school. I stayed up late, drawing a picture of our family for art class. It wasn't amazing, but I was proud of it. I remember running up to my mom, clutching it in my hands, expecting her to smile or, at the very least, say something nice. But instead, she barely looked at it. She took it with a brief "that's nice" and tossed it onto a pile of papers. Later that day, Savannah came home with a math test she'd aced, and my mom practically screamed in joy. She hugged her, praised her, and even called our relatives to let them know how brilliant Savannah was. That art project ended up in the trash a week later. They never asked me about it again. The favoritism didn't just stop at small things. As we got older, it became painfully clear that Savannah was going to have every opportunity handed to her, while I'd be left to figure things out on my own. When Savannah was struggling with math one year, my parents hired a tutor. They set her up in a quiet room, bought all the supplies she could possibly need, and even cut back on family expenses so they could afford her lessons. When I struggled in school, particularly in English, which was always hard for me, my parents would just tell me to try harder. I never got a tutor. When I asked for help, they'd brush me off, saying, "You'll figure it out." It hurt. It hurt a lot. I didn't understand why my parents couldn't see that I needed support too. But after a while, I stopped asking. What was the point? I began keeping to myself, spending more time alone in my room. I started to build my own little world, one where I could ignore the reality of my family's indifference. High school was where it really hit me. By then, it was obvious to everyone that Savannah was on a fast track to success, while I was just floating. My grades were average at best, and I wasn't particularly athletic or talented. I didn't shine in any way, and I knew my parents were disappointed. They'd given up even pretending to care about my future. I remember this one time, during my junior year of high school, when I brought home my report card. I'd actually worked my ass off that semester and managed to get mostly B's, which was a huge improvement for me. I was proud, even though it wasn't anything spectacular by Savannah's standards. I handed it to my mom, hoping she'd at least give me a nod of approval. She glanced at it, raised an eyebrow, and said, "Well, it's not exactly an A, is it?" I felt crushed. I tried so hard, and all I got was a reminder of how I'd never measure up to Savannah. Meanwhile, Savannah was in her senior year, applying to colleges. My parents were all over it, helping her with applications, taking her on tours, and constantly bragging about her achievements to anyone who would listen. They'd sit at the dinner table, discussing her future as if it was the most important thing in the world. I'd sit there, invisible, eating in silence, feeling like I didn't even exist. When it came time for me to apply to college, I had no clue what I was doing. My parents didn't help me. They didn't take me on college tours or help me with my applications. It was like they'd poured everything they had into Savannah and had nothing left for me. I applied to a few state schools on my own, figuring that was the best I could hope for. One day, I overheard my parents talking. My mom said something like, "I just don't see Jackson going anywhere. He's not like Savannah." My dad agreed, saying they couldn't waste their resources on someone who didn't have a clear future. It hurt more than I can even describe. It was as if they decided I was a lost cause, someone not worth investing in. Savannah, of course, got into her dream school, a prestigious university that cost a fortune. My parents paid for everything: tuition, books, even an apartment near campus. When I got into a local community college, they barely acknowledged it. They told me I'd have to pay my own way, so I took out loans and worked part-time to cover my expenses. Living on my own was both liberating and heartbreaking. For the first time, I didn't have to deal with the constant reminder that I was less than my sister. But it also made me realize just how little my family cared about me. They'd visit Savannah regularly, bringing her gifts and taking her out for dinners. They never came to see me. It was as if I'd been erased from their lives entirely. During my second year of college, I tried reaching out to them, hoping maybe things could change. I called my mom one day, asking if she wanted to grab lunch. She told me she was too busy helping Savannah with some project. I tried again a few weeks later, inviting them to an art show I was part of. My dad brushed me off, saying they had other commitments. Those commitments turned out to be a weekend getaway with Savannah. At this point, I had stopped expecting anything from them. I'd learned to fend for myself, to create my own support system among friends and mentors. But the resentment lingered, a constant reminder of everything I'd been denied simply because I wasn't Savannah. After a while, I started to feel like my life was stuck. Even though I was attending a community college, it wasn't what I really wanted. My true dream? Going to the UK for college. I don't even know how it started, but at some point, I became obsessed with the idea of studying abroad. I'd spend hours online, reading about the universities, the culture, and the whole experience of living in a new country. It felt like a fresh start, a place where nobody knew about Savannah or my parents or the constant comparison. But I also knew the one obvious, massive roadblock standing in my way: money. Asking my parents for financial help was out of the question. They'd made it painfully clear that all their resources were reserved for Savannah. I could imagine the look on my mom's face if I'd even hinted at needing help to go to the UK. She'd probably laugh or, worse, roll her eyes and tell me to be realistic. And my dad would shake his head, reminding me that they'd already given so much to my sister. But there was one person I thought might understand: my Aunt Alice. Aunt Alice was my mom's younger sister, and she was kind of a black sheep in the family. She'd never married, traveled the world on her own terms, and didn't really care much about proper family expectations. Growing up, she'd always been my favorite relative. She was funny, quirky, and actually listened to me. When I'd tell her about my interests or frustrations, she wouldn't dismiss me like my parents did. Aunt Alice treated me like I mattered. Reaching out to her wasn't an easy decision, though. I didn't want her to think I was just using her for money. But as I saw it, she was my only hope of making this dream real. One Saturday, after wrestling with myself about it for days, I finally called her and asked if we could meet up. She sounded thrilled and suggested we go to her favorite little cafe downtown. When I walked in, she was already there, sitting in a corner booth, waving enthusiastically. Her smile was infectious. We spent the first half hour catching up, and I could feel the usual warmth and calm that came from being around her. She asked me about school, and I gave her the usual answers, carefully dancing around the topic I'd actually come to talk about. Finally, when the words started pressing against my chest, I just let them out. "Actually, Aunt Alice, there's something I need to talk to you about." Something big. Her face softened, and she leaned in, giving me her full attention. "You know you can tell me anything, Jackson." I took a deep breath and started to explain my dream of going to college in the UK. I told her about the programs I'd been looking at, the scholarships I'd applied for and been denied, and how, deep down, I felt like this was my only chance to really be me. By the time I finished, I realized I'd been talking nonstop, spilling every little hope and fear I'd bottled up. I braced myself for her reaction, half expecting her to tell me it was impossible. But she just looked at me with this mix of sadness and pride. "Jackson, I had no idea you felt this way. I'm sorry you couldn't come to your parents about this." but I'm proud of you for wanting something more. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I wasn't crazy for wanting this. Someone finally understood. But then came the harder part, asking for her help. I can't do this on my own, Aunt Alice. I don't have the money. I don't have the resources. But if you could, maybe, loan me the money, just enough to get started. I promise I'll pay you back. My voice cracked a little, and I looked down, embarrassed. Without hesitation, she reached across the table, took my hand and said, "You don't have to pay me back. I'll help you, Jackson. I'll make this happen." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Relief and gratitude washed over me, and I could barely hold back tears. I wanted to jump across the table and hug her, but we were in public, and I didn't want to cause a scene. We sat there, just smiling at each other, both of us knowing this was the start of something big. However, there was one condition we both knew without needing to say it aloud. This had to stay between us. My parents could never know. If they found out, it would cause chaos, probably more for Aunt Alice than for me. My parents already had a strained relationship with her, thinking she was too free-spirited and irresponsible. If they found out she was supporting me, their less successful child, I didn't even want to imagine the fallout. We decided to keep things under wraps. Aunt Alice transferred the money in small amounts so it wouldn't draw attention. I started the application process, biting my nails every step of the way, terrified that someone in my family would find out. I checked my email obsessively, waiting for updates from the UK colleges. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, I got an acceptance letter from one of my top choice universities. I was in. Telling Aunt Alice was the best moment of my life. We met up at her place, and I showed her the acceptance letter. She hugged me so tight, saying how proud she was. "This is your chance, Jackson," she said, eyes shining. "You're going to make a life for yourself over there." As the summer crept closer, the reality of leaving hit me. I couldn't just up and disappear without telling my parents, so I told them I'd been accepted into an exchange program. They were barely interested, which stung, but at least it kept them from asking too many questions. My dad just said, "Good for you, son," before heading back to his newspaper. A few weeks before I was set to leave, Aunt Alice threw a small, private goodbye party for me. She'd invited a few close friends and some extended family members, people who knew the truth but agreed to keep it quiet. The evening was full of laughter, hugs, and, for the first time, genuine happiness for my future. My aunt's best friend, a woman named Carol, took me aside at one point and said, "You know, you've got a good aunt here. Don't ever forget that." I didn't need reminding. I knew how lucky I was. The day I flew out was surreal. I'd packed my bags, ready to step into a life that was finally mine. Aunt Alice drove me to the airport. As we hugged goodbye, I could feel her shaking. She whispered, "Live for yourself, Jackson. Don't look back." I promised I would. When the plane took off, I looked out the window, watching the city I'd grown up in disappear below. I was leaving behind a life of neglect and resentment and heading toward a future I'd built with my own hands. Well, with Aunt Alice's help, too. I wasn't just going to study. I was reclaiming my own life. Life in the UK was everything I had hoped for. I felt liberated, like I was finally becoming my own person, far away from the suffocating expectations and constant comparisons back home. I kept in touch with Aunt Alice every week, calling her to share updates and thank her endlessly for giving me this chance. My grades were strong, I was making friends, and I'd even started thinking about potential internships. For the first time, I was optimistic about the future. But, of course, it couldn't last forever. About 6 months into my time abroad, I got a call from Savannah. I was surprised, to say the least. Savannah never called me. Our conversations had always been short and mostly consisted of her reminding me of her successes. Her voice was overly cheerful, too, which felt off. She asked all these weird questions like, "How's school going? Is Aunt Alice still helping you out?" I dodged the questions as best as I could, keeping it polite but vague. Something about that call didn't sit right with me, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe she was just trying to be nice for once. Little did I know, it was only the beginning of something far more sinister. About a week later, I got a frantic email from Aunt Alice. She'd just heard from my mom, who'd gone on a rant about how I had betrayed the family. According to my mom, Savannah had evidence that I'd been sharing personal, family business secrets with Aunt Alice in exchange for her financial support. It was nonsense, of course. Aunt Alice didn't even care about my parents' affairs. She just wanted to see me succeed. But it didn't matter. Somehow, Savannah had twisted everything around. I called Aunt Alice immediately, heart pounding. She sounded shaken, telling me how my parents had contacted her, furious and demanding to know everything. They'd accused her of manipulating me, of using me to gather information about their finances and personal matters. I was in shock. Aunt Alice assured me she didn't believe any of it, but she was worried. Your parents are serious, Jackson. They're talking about cutting you off entirely, she warned. The worst part? Savannah had somehow convinced them that I'd been feeding Aunt Alice private family information in return for money. She'd even fabricated messages that looked like I'd been spilling family secrets. I didn't know how she'd pulled it off, but knowing Savannah, she'd probably gone to insane lengths to make it look real. My parents, who never gave me the benefit of the doubt, believed her immediately. To them, I was already guilty. I didn't hear from my parents for days, which only fueled my anxiety. Finally, I decided to call them myself, desperate to clear my name. My mom answered, and I barely got a hello out before she launched into a tirade. How could you, Jackson? She spat. How could you betray your own family? After everything we've done for you. The irony of that statement almost made me laugh. But I managed to keep my composure, telling her that none of it was true, that Savannah had set me up. But she wasn't having any of it. We've seen the messages, Jackson, she said coldly. Savannah showed us everything. You sold us out for a bit of extra cash from your aunt. I always knew you were irresponsible, but I never thought you'd stoop this low. My dad came on the line next, his voice full of disappointment and anger. You've embarrassed this family, Jackson. We don't even know who you are anymore. I pleaded with them to see reason, to give me a chance to explain, but they were unyielding. Savannah's evidence was all they needed to turn their backs on me. I was numb, devastated. They told me they were cutting me off completely and that I was no longer welcome in their home. They'd even notified the university that they were no longer supporting me financially, leaving me scrambling to figure out how I'd cover tuition, rent, everything. Just like that, my life in the UK, my dream, was at risk of collapsing. Desperate, I called Savannah, hoping I could somehow get through to her, make her see the damage she was causing. She answered with that same smug, fake sweetness she'd used in our last conversation. Oh, hey, Jackson, she chirped, feigning innocence. Is everything okay? I couldn't hold back. Why, Savannah? Why are you doing this? What did I ever do to you? She laughed, a cold, calculated sound. Oh, Jackson, don't be so dramatic. You never belonged over there, and honestly, someone had to bring you back down to reality. Do you really think you deserve everything Aunt Alice gave you? That should have been mine. I was speechless. All this time, I'd thought her indifference towards me was just normal sibling rivalry. But this was something darker, something twisted. Savannah was so obsessed with being the favorite, with being the only one who mattered, that she'd gone to these insane lengths to ruin my life. I tried to reason with her, but it was no use. She had what she wanted. My parents' undivided attention and their loyalty. As far as she was concerned, I was out of the picture. After that call, I was left in a daze, trying to figure out my next move. Aunt Alice, bless her, offered to help me financially again, but I could tell this whole ordeal had shaken her, too. She didn't have unlimited resources, and with my parents practically declaring war on her for corrupting me, she was caught in the middle. Days passed in a blur as I scrambled to figure out my next steps. The university gave me a short grace period, but without my parents' financial backing, I was in real danger of having to drop out. The thought of returning home, of facing Savannah and my parents after everything they'd done, was unbearable. One night, after hours of pacing and calling everyone I could think of, I found myself wandering the empty campus, feeling completely lost. My phone buzzed. It was Aunt Alice. She'd been doing some digging, determined to clear my name. She told me she'd hired a lawyer to investigate Savannah's so-called evidence. She wasn't going to let her niece's lies ruin my life if she could help it. It was the first glimmer of hope I'd had in days. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this nightmare. But even as I clung to that hope, I knew that no matter what happened, my relationship with my family was shattered beyond repair. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and sleepless nights as Aunt Alice and her lawyer worked to disprove Savannah's story. Savannah, for her part, dug in her heels, spinning more lies to cover her tracks. She'd planted fake messages, created bogus email chains, everything meticulously crafted to make me look like the villain. My parents, of course, believed every word, refusing to even entertain the idea that their golden child could be lying. I felt like I was drowning, caught in a web of lies with no way out. But Aunt Alice never gave up. Slowly, piece by piece, her lawyers started to uncover the truth. Savannah's fabrications were elaborate, but they weren't flawless. After weeks of digging, they finally found the proof they needed. A trail of digital fingerprints linking Savannah to the fake messages and fabricated evidence. Armed with this information, Aunt Alice confronted my parents, presenting them with undeniable proof that Savannah had lied. But even then, they were reluctant to believe it. They'd spent so long idolizing Savannah that the idea of her being anything less than perfect was almost unthinkable. In the end, though, they had no choice. The evidence was irrefutable. My mom called me, her voice hollow, apologetic but not really sorry. We were wrong, Jackson. I don't know what to say. She didn't sound devastated, just inconvenienced. Like this whole mess was more of a hassle than a betrayal. My dad was even colder. He admitted they'd made a mistake, but quickly tried to shift the blame, saying, "You should have come to us. If you hadn't kept secrets, this wouldn't have happened." There was no real apology, no remorse for the pain they'd caused, just a sense of annoyance that their lives had been disrupted. Savannah? She never even acknowledged what she'd done. As far as she was concerned, I was still the problem. My parents swept the whole thing under the rug, determined to maintain the illusion of a perfect family. They never told anyone else about what had happened, and Savannah faced no real consequences. They still saw her as the golden child, their star, while I was just there, an afterthought. I cut ties with them after that. It was painful, but I couldn't stay connected to people who saw me as disposable. Aunt Alice remained my only family, and I'll forever be grateful to her for standing by me when no one else would. I stayed in the UK, finished my degree, and built a life for myself far away from the toxic mess that was my family. Sometimes, I still wonder if they ever think about me, if they realize what they lost. But then I remind myself that I've built something better on my own, a life where I'm finally valued for who I am, not as a shadow of someone else's success. After the fallout with my parents, Aunt Alice took me in without hesitation. I moved into her cozy, cluttered home on the outskirts of a small town, and it felt more like a safe haven than anywhere I'd lived before. It wasn't anything grand, just a small, two-bedroom place filled with quirky antiques and stacks of books Alice had collected over her many years of travel. But to me, it was perfect. Living with her was a breath of fresh air. There was no judgment, no comparisons, just a quiet acceptance. For the first time, I felt like I could just exist. Aunt Alice respected my space, gave me time to process everything, and gradually, I started to feel like myself again. A couple of weeks after I'd settled in, we had a night that changed everything. It was one of those quiet evenings. We were sitting in her living room, sipping tea, talking about nothing in particular. Out of nowhere, she turned to me, her eyes serious. "Jackson, there's something I need to tell you. Something I probably should have told you a long time ago." I sat up, suddenly alert. There was a weight in her voice that I hadn't heard before. She took a deep breath, looking down at her hands before starting. "There's a reason your father has always been so hard on you. It's not fair and it's not right, but it goes back to when we were kids." I was confused. What did her childhood have to do with the way my father treated me? "You know, your father and I weren't always this distant," she said. "When we were younger, we were close, or at least, I thought we were. But things changed when I started doing well in school. I loved learning, always wanted to push myself, and I did well. Too well, maybe." I couldn't imagine anyone being jealous of Aunt Alice. She was the most down-to-earth, kind-hearted person I knew. But as she continued, I started to see things differently. Your grandfather was difficult, she said, choosing her words carefully. He wasn't an easy man to live with, and he had very clear ideas about who was supposed to succeed in the family. He wanted his son, your father, to be the best. But when I started getting better grades, winning awards well, it created a rift between us. She paused, her face shadowed with memories. Your father started resenting me. No matter what I did, he saw it as a competition, a threat to his own place in the family. I never wanted that, of course, but it's the way things were. I listened, the pieces starting to fall into place. My father had always seemed deeply insecure, constantly worried about appearances, about how he measured up. I'd never understood why he was so obsessed with success and perfection, but hearing Alice talk about their father made it all make sense. He never forgave me for outshining him, she continued. To him, I was the smart one, the one who got everything he felt he deserved. And that bitterness, it carried over into his family, into his children. She looked at me, her eyes full of sorrow. Jackson, I think that's why he's always been so hard on you. In a way, you remind him of me. You're driven, you want more from life, and that scares him. He's afraid of seeing his own son become something he thinks he could never be. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. All this time, I thought there was something wrong with me, some flaw that made my parents love Savannah more. But it wasn't about me at all. It was about my father's insecurities, his unresolved issues with his own family. I wasn't just competing with Savannah. I was up against decades of family history, of resentment and rivalry that had nothing to do with me. I felt a wave of anger and relief, emotions swirling in a confusing mix. It wasn't fair, but at least it was an explanation. At least now, I understood. Over the next few days, Aunt Alice opened up more and more. She told me stories about their childhood, about how my father had always been desperate for approval. She told me how he'd struggled in school, how their father had berated him for not living up to his expectations. She even shared some of her own guilt, admitting that she'd sometimes downplayed her achievements just to keep the peace. I wanted him to feel like he was enough, she said one evening. But no matter what I did, he couldn't let go of the jealousy. It became his whole identity. Hearing all this, I felt a strange mix of sympathy and resentment. I could see why my father was the way he was, but it didn't excuse the way he'd treated me. And knowing that he'd let his own insecurities poison our relationship, that was something I didn't think I could ever forgive. Living with Aunt Alice was a healing experience, but it was also eye-opening in ways I hadn't expected. She'd known for years about the family dynamics, about the undercurrent of jealousy and resentment, and she tried her best to protect me from it. But at the same time, she felt like she'd failed, like she hadn't done enough to shield me from the fallout. We had long, deep conversations about family, about how complicated and painful those bonds could be. Aunt Alice didn't sugarcoat anything, and I appreciated her honesty. She didn't try to make excuses for my father or my mother. She simply told me the truth, and in doing so, she gave me a new perspective on my own life. One evening, as we were talking, she told me something that would stick with me forever. Jackson, sometimes family isn't about blood. It's about the people who stand by you, who support you for who you are. I may not be perfect, but I'm here for you, and I always will be. That night, I went to bed feeling lighter, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I'd spent so much of my life trying to earn my parents' approval, to be good enough for them, that I'd forgotten to be good enough for myself. Aunt Alice was right. I didn't need their validation to be worthy. I was enough, just as I was. The months passed, and I started to build a new life for myself. Aunt Alice encouraged me to pursue my passions, to take risks and live without the fear of failure that had held me back for so long. With her support, I finally began to feel like I was on solid ground, like I had a future worth fighting for. As time went on, I started to think less and less about my parents. The anger faded, replaced by a sense of acceptance. I'd never be their golden child, their perfect son, and that was okay. I had my own path to follow, and I didn't need their approval to walk it. But the scars remained. Every now and then, I'd catch myself doubting, wondering if maybe I'd misunderstood, if there was still a chance for reconciliation. But then I'd remember the years of neglect, the way they'd sided with Savannah without a second thought, and the doubt would disappear. Living with Aunt Alice taught me more than I ever could have imagined. She showed me that family was complicated, messy, and often painful, but it didn't have to define who I was. I could choose my own path, my own happiness, and I didn't have to let anyone else's expectations hold me back. In the end, my time with Aunt Alice became the foundation for a new beginning. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. I'd learned the truth about my family, about myself, and I'd come out stronger on the other side. Once I left for the UK, it felt like a weight I hadn't fully understood was lifted from my shoulders. Living far from my family, I found a sense of peace I hadn't realized was possible. I dove into my studies, immersing myself in classes that genuinely interested me, meeting people who knew nothing about Savannah or my parents. I was finally able to be myself. No pressure, no constant reminders of what I lacked compared to Savannah. My new life brought new friends and experiences. One of my closest friends was a guy named Oliver, a fellow international student from Canada. He had this easygoing energy, the type that made it impossible to be in a bad mood around him. Oliver didn't care about grades, status, or family expectations. He was just happy. He was the first person I felt like I could truly open up to, and over time, I started sharing bits and pieces about my family. His reaction was always the same: complete disbelief. He couldn't fathom a family where a parent could put so much pressure on one child while ignoring the other. "Mate," he'd say in his easy drawl, "you're well out of that mess. Here's to building your own life, yeah?" It was the first time I felt validated in my decision to walk away, and it gave me the courage to fully commit to my new life. I stopped checking in on my parents and blocked Savannah on social media. I didn't need constant reminders of their lives, and I didn't want them intruding on mine. Aunt Alice kept in touch, of course. She was always my lifeline back to a kind of family, and whenever she'd mention my parents, it was with a careful, neutral tone, as if she didn't want to remind me of old wounds. As the months turned into years, I found myself becoming someone new. I excelled in my courses, and soon enough, I was interning at a respected firm. My supervisor, Margaret, was a powerhouse in finance. She was blunt, sharp, and had zero tolerance for nonsense, but she was also the most encouraging mentor I'd ever had. Margaret pushed me in ways that weren't rooted in judgment or comparison. With her, I felt supported and challenged in a way I'd never experienced before. "Jackson," she'd say, "you've got the brains for this industry. Don't doubt yourself." Those words meant more to me than I could express. Her mentorship gave me a confidence I'd never had under my father's critical eye. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I'd built a small, close-knit group of friends, developed a passion for my career, and found myself planning for a future that didn't include running back to my parents for validation. I was free, finally free from the ghosts of my family's expectations. 3 years passed like a whirlwind. I graduated with honors and landed a position at a top firm in London. My life was everything I'd ever hoped for, and I felt like I'd finally escaped the shadows of my past. The UK felt like home now, and I barely thought of my family back in the States. It was as if that part of my life had faded into the background, a memory I didn't need to revisit. Then, out of nowhere, I got an email from my mother. I stared at her name in my inbox, feeling a surge of conflicting emotions. I hadn't heard from her in years, and seeing her name brought back a flood of memories I thought I'd buried. The email was short and to the point. She said the family business was struggling, and they needed my help. She didn't even ask how I was doing, or if I'd be open to talking. It was all about the business. Part of me wanted to delete the message without replying. After everything they'd put me through, why should I lift a finger to help them? But curiosity got the better of me. I responded with a single line. "What do you need help with?" She replied within minutes, as if she'd been waiting. She explained that the business had been in decline for a few years now. Apparently, Savannah had been managing it after graduating, but things weren't going well. They'd lost major clients, expenses were out of control, and their reputation had taken a hit. She didn't say it outright, but it was clear they were desperate. In her words, they needed someone with fresh insights to help turn things around. She made a point to say that they'd heard I'd been doing well in finance, as if they'd been keeping tabs on me this whole time. I couldn't help but feel a bit of satisfaction, a sense that maybe they'd finally seen my worth. But at the same time, a nagging voice reminded me of everything they'd put me through. Did they really care about me, or was I just a lifeline, a last resort because they had nowhere else to turn? I called Aunt Alice that night, needing her perspective. She listened quietly as I explained the situation, not interrupting until I'd finished. Well, she said after a pause, it sounds like they've backed themselves into a corner. But, Jackson, you don't owe them anything. Not after the way they treated you. Her words resonated. She was right. I didn't owe them. But a part of me still wanted to prove myself, to show them what I was capable of, even if they didn't deserve it. After wrestling with myself for a few days, I decided to at least hear them out. I agreed to a video call, more out of curiosity than anything else. My mother's face appeared on the screen, looking older, worn down. My father was next to her, his expression hard, as if he still held some grudge he couldn't let go of. Savannah was absent, which I found interesting. Jackson, my mother began, her tone soft but strained. We need your expertise. It felt strange hearing her talk to me like this. I'd never heard her use words like expertise when referring to me. They explained the situation in detail. The company was hemorrhaging money, employees were leaving, and they had debts piling up. Apparently, Savannah had been in over her head, making risky decisions that backfired, and now they were paying the price. I listened, saying little. When they were done, my mother looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. So, what do you think? I took a moment before answering. I think you should have come to me a long time ago. They shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. My father cleared his throat, clearly unhappy with my bluntness. But I didn't care. For once, I held the power, and it was a heady feeling. Eventually, I agreed to look into their finances, but I made it clear that I was doing this on my terms. If I helped, I would have full control over the decisions. They reluctantly agreed, and within days, I was poring over the company's records, uncovering years of mismanagement. The more I dug, the clearer it became that Savannah had been way out of her depth. She'd been making impulsive decisions, cutting corners, and alienating clients. There were entire files missing, critical information she hadn't documented properly. It was a mess, one that would take months to fix. But part of me was determined to do it, if only to show them what they'd overlooked. I worked late into the nights, devising a strategy to get them out of the red and stabilize the company. It was grueling work, but I found myself surprisingly invested. I wanted to succeed, not for them, but for myself. This was a chance to prove what I was capable of. Over the next few months, I took control of the company's finances, cutting unnecessary expenses, negotiating with clients, and streamlining operations. I called in favors, reached out to contacts, and did everything in my power to turn things around. Slowly but surely, I began to see results. My parents were grateful, but it was a hollow kind of gratitude. There were no apologies, no acknowledgments of the past, just an unspoken understanding that they needed me. Savannah, I learned, had stepped down from her position. She disappeared from the picture entirely, unwilling to face the reality of her failures. In a way, I pitied her, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction of stepping into her place, of showing my parents that I was more than they'd ever given me credit for. By the time I'd finished, the company was back on solid ground. I'd done what they'd asked and more. And then, with a sense of finality, I walked away. I handed over the reins, making it clear that I was done, that this was the last time they'd ever get my help. As I packed up my things, ready to return to my own life, my mother approached me. For the first time, she looked at me with something resembling genuine regret. "Thank you, Jackson," she said quietly. I know we haven't always been fair to you." It was the closest I'd ever get to an apology, and while it wasn't enough, it was something. I gave her a curt nod, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. This was it, the end of the road with my family. I left that day knowing that I'd done everything I could. I'd proven myself, not just to them, but to myself. And as I walked away, I felt a sense of closure, a peace that had been years in the making. For the first time, I was free. After everything I'd done to save my family's business, I thought I might feel some sort of closure or peace, but instead, I felt drained. I'd given them months of my life, poured everything I had into turning things around, and for what? There'd been no apologies, no genuine gratitude, just a temporary truce in a relationship that had been broken for as long as I could remember. A few months after I left the company in their hands, my phone started buzzing again. It was my mother, calling and leaving messages about how things had taken another downturn. Apparently, without my constant oversight, the business was slipping back into its old ways. When I didn't respond, the messages became more insistent. Then my father started calling, his messages terse, frustrated, as if I was somehow obligated to drop everything and fix their mistakes once more. After several weeks of this, I finally answered. My mother's voice was tense, a mix of desperation and irritation. "Jackson, we need you to come back. Things are going downhill fast, and we can't manage without you." I took a slow, deep breath, steadying myself. "Mom, I'm not coming back." There was a silence on the other end, as if she couldn't comprehend what I just said. "But after everything we've done for you." "Everything you've done for me?" I laughed, a bitter sound that caught her off guard. "Mom, let's be honest. You've never been there for me. Not when I was a kid, not when I needed support, and certainly not when Savannah framed me and you both threw me out without a second thought." She started to sputter, trying to come up with some excuse, some explanation. "Jackson, it was a misunderstanding. We were just, you chose Savannah over me." "Every time, without question," I interrupted. "And the only person who ever actually supported me was Aunt Alice. She's the only reason I made it this far. So no, I don't owe you anything." There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing, could almost picture her trying to think of something to say that would convince me to change my mind. "Jackson, please," she finally said, her voice softer, almost pleading. "We're family. Can't you put the past behind us and just help us?" I closed my eyes, steadying the mix of anger and sadness welling up inside me. "If you need help, Mom, why don't you go to Savannah? She's always been the one you relied on, right?" My father's voice came through the speaker then, hard and cold. "Jackson, that's enough. We're still your parents, and we expect you to show us some respect." "Respect?" I could barely contain the bitterness in my voice. "You don't get to demand respect from me after the way you treated me. I'm done. I've built a life for myself, and I don't owe you anything. So go to Savannah, go to anyone else, but leave me out of it." I hung up before they could respond, feeling a strange sense of release wash over me. For the first time, I'd spoken my truth to them, laid it all out without holding back. I'd spent my entire life trying to win their approval, but now, I realized I didn't need it. I didn't need them at all. A few days later, I received an unexpected visit. I was coming home from work when I saw Savannah waiting outside my building, arms crossed, wearing an expression of barely contained annoyance. I almost laughed at the sight. Of course she'd show up, expecting me to just fall in line and fix everything for her. "Jackson," she said the moment I approached, her tone a mix of irritation and impatience. "We need to talk." I walked past her, unlocking my door without a word. She followed me inside, clearly expecting me to roll over and listen to whatever demand she had. I dropped my bag on the counter and turned to face her, crossing my arms. "What do you want, Savannah?" She didn't waste any time. "The business is falling apart again. You need to come back and fix it." I raised an eyebrow, unable to believe her audacity. "I need to? After everything you did to me?" She rolled her eyes, as if my anger was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Oh, stop being so dramatic. That was years ago, and it's not my fault if you're still holding on to grudges." I felt my anger flare, but I kept my voice calm. "You framed me, Savannah. You went out of your way to ruin my life, and our parents believed every word you said. Why on earth would I ever help you now?" She scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Because you're good at this. You've proven that you can handle things, and we need someone who actually knows what they're doing." I laughed, shaking my head. "Unbelievable. You still don't get it, do you? I'm not your safety net. I'm not here to clean up your messes. You've spent your entire life putting me down, and now you expect me to bail you out?" Her expression hardened, the mask slipping for just a moment. Fine, she snapped. Be selfish. But remember, this is your family. We're supposed to help each other. I met her gaze, feeling nothing but a cold detachment. You're right. We're family, and family is supposed to support each other. But you never supported me, Savannah. None of you did. So I'm done. You'll have to figure it out on your own. She looked at me with a mixture of anger and disbelief, as if she couldn't fathom the idea of me turning her down. For the first time, I saw a hint of vulnerability in her eyes, a flicker of fear that maybe, just maybe, things wouldn't go her way this time. But I felt nothing for her. The years of resentment, the endless comparisons, the betrayal, it had all left me numb. Without another word, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle over me. It was done. I'd finally cut the last tie binding me to my family's toxicity. But, of course, it wasn't truly over. A few days later, my parents showed up at my door. They looked different, older, worn down by stress and desperation. My father's expression was tense, his shoulders hunched, and my mother looked as if she'd been crying. Jackson, my father began, his voice gruff but softer than I'd ever heard it. We came to apologize. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. Apologize for what? My mother swallowed, looking down at her hands. For everything. For the way we treated you, for believing Savannah without question. We know we made mistakes. Big ones. And we're sorry. Their words felt hollow, as if they were rehearsed, but there was something in their faces, a weariness that suggested they'd finally realized the depth of their mistakes. I sighed, feeling a strange mix of emotions. You have no idea what it was like for me, I said quietly. I spent my entire life trying to be good enough for you, but it was never enough. You always chose Savannah, always believed her lies over my truth. And now, you expect me to just forget all of that? My father looked away, guilt etched on his face. My mother's eyes were glistening with unshed tears. We know, she whispered, and we're asking for your forgiveness. I shook my head, feeling a deep sadness settle in my chest. I can't give you that. Not after everything. They stood there, silent, as if they didn't know what else to say. Eventually, my father nodded, a look of resignation on his face. Thank you, Jackson, he said quietly, his voice barely audible, for at least hearing us out. I nodded, unable to say anything more. They turned and left, their figures retreating down the hallway, and for the first time, I felt a sense of finality, a closing of a chapter that had haunted me for years. I closed the door, leaning against it as a wave of relief washed over me. I was finally free. Free from the expectations, the comparisons, the endless cycle of disappointment. I'd built a life for myself, one that didn't rely on their approval, and I realized that I didn't need them to be happy. That evening, I sat alone, feeling a peace I hadn't felt in years. I was free to live my life on my own terms, unburdened by the weight of my family's expectations. For the first time, I could look toward the future without the shadows of the past holding me back. I was free, and it felt like nothing I'd ever known before.